Good morning, everybody. So warm welcome this morning. Beautiful day, lovely start to it. So I just wanted to give everybody a little bit of time here to get into the room. We've had a good response to today's follow-up, and just want to welcome James Kidd and David Mills from Mills Reeve. Morning, both.
Morning.
And good opportunity to say thank you. So we had our first furlough scheme update webinar, which was now a few weeks ago, really good content was put together, and of course the terms and conditions are changing almost as we did the presentation last week. I think as soon as we put the slides down, I think they then extended it through to the month of June, so which was great, and another further goalpost extended that's going to help the businesses, UK businesses out there. But I guess what we are some more questions that could well need answering now. So we wanted to do a follow-up. So this is today's session. So today we're going to be covering a bit more about what some of those unasked questions might be. And there's going to be some opportunity here to interact. So we would, for those that haven't used this software before, there's two options of asking questions. So if we could ask that you move to the chat function, so that will then be displayed, so James and David will both be able to see your questions. So anything that comes up through the slides and is relevant to that time, please feel free just to put that into the chat function, and we'll do our best to get those questions answered as and when we go along. For any others, and if there's lots of questions that are coming through, we can maybe look at an FAQ sheet. I know we sent one of those out before. We will also, just give you a little bit of an idea about how it's going to run, we'll also be recording the session. So in today's session, it will then be sent out to people, so you can then have a look at the content. We'll also send out the slides as well. So don't worry too much about making lots of notes. You can have this in the background while you're doing perhaps other things this morning as well. So just sort of seen flashed up here that we've got about 50 people coming to the room already. So I guess what I'll do is I will come back into the session at the end, but I want to hand over now to both David and to James to give you both a good opportunity now to kind of introduce yourselves, a bit of background, and then I will see you both at the end. But thanks very much, and I will see you soon.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. Good to see you again. Hope you are all well. So if we move on to the slide, James, with what we're going to be talking about today. So we've got the agenda next. So two things. So what's happened actually since we last spoke on the 15th of April? Short answer, quite a lot. Quite a lot actually happened that afternoon. So we shall have a look at that. And then secondly, what happens next? The government, Boris, on Sunday is due to make some announcements about potential easing from lockdown. We obviously anticipate a gradual return to work. With that, there's going to be some really key questions that we need to look at from an employment law perspective. So we are going to have a look at those today. The other really important thing is furlough coming to an end, and James will just reiterate, and as Mark said, that has been extended to the end of June. It's looking unlikely it's going to be extended much beyond that, or certainly possibly in a different form, and we'll have a look at that. But from a timing perspective, obviously at that point the economy would not have returned to any decent shape whatsoever. So some really important decisions are going to have to be made. So we're going to have a look at things such as collective redundancies, etc. So that's the format of this morning. We've got an hour. As with last time, it went really, really quickly. As Mark said, please do send through your questions as we're going along. We won't have time to answer all of the questions, but we'll pick as many out as we can and answer as many as we can. So that's the format. I'm going to hand over to James. So James, apart from your and my hair growing a little bit over the last 2 weeks, what's happened since the 15th of April?
Well, actually, I had a little bit of a trim last night in anticipation of this, but you know, hey, but not on top, which is growing a lot. Thank you. So scheme extended to the 30th of June, so that's 4 months in total. In my view, the Chancellor will extend beyond the 30th of June, whether that is in a form of formal extension for everybody, formal extension for some sectors, some types of work, whether that will be actually changing the nature of the grant. So instead of it being 80% capped at £2,500, a reduced subsidy or decreasing subsidy remains to be seen. So I think we're looking at probably mid-May for the Chancellor to be making those types of announcements, and we'll come on to timing later. It's very important as to how getting our ducks in a row on timing. So one of the things that we had come out, I think it was the night before we did the last one of these, was the Treasury Direction, which set out some specifics on how HMRC is going to deal with the grant, and that put a interesting spanner in the works about consent, and David is going to talk about consent and pick that up. So the principal form of information on how the furlough scheme works is called the guidance. We're on the 8th iteration of that. Government never helpfully does a red line and just leaves us to work out what has changed. So we haven't had any legislation, it's just been guidance that we've had. We've also had new guidance, as you can see on the slide, for calculating 80% of the wages, and I'm not proposing to go into too much detail on that. So what was really exciting for everybody, I'm sure, was I think it was at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 20th of April, the portal opened. Hurrah! There was a fanfare, it promptly crashed and then recovered. So interestingly, the stats on this slide are slightly out of date, so I've got something better than that. So as at 3rd of May, I think it is, we had something like 800,000 employers who had put the claims in, totaling 6.3 million furloughed workers, which is a value of 8 billion. So 8 billion, up from 4.5 billion as at 23rd of April. So it's estimated that it's 42 billion. It will be 42 billion over 3 months. And it will be a run rate of a further 12 billion for every extra month at that level. That is a huge amount of money. So now I'm just going to ask you to do a quick poll with me to see whether anybody has actually had the experience of working the HMRC. Put the slide back up. Let's have a quick look. Most of you haven't used it yet. All right, I'm going to end it now so that we'd say, all right. So 77% of you have not used it yet, 3% have used it and had difficulties, 21% have used it and said it was easy to navigate. Okay, interesting. Let me get rid of that. So this is what we're going to be covering in terms of specific areas. I said David is going to do with consent. That's all about, do we need the employee's consent to put them on furlough? Are there any implications of that? I'll deal with annual leave, the whole holiday piece. The government extended to the 19th of March from the 28th of Feb. Does that actually help anybody? David will deal with that. I'll come back and deal with pension, and then we'll look at consultation, and can you have employees on furlough and still undertaking consultation? David.
Yeah, so I'm not going to go into huge detail about consent because we looked at that last time. You know, as you know, when an employee goes on furlough, you do need their agreement. So the recommendation, and we did a poll last time, is that you send out, so you agree it with the employee, they go on furlough, you confirm that in writing. Okay. The Treasury Direction actually came out in the afternoon of the day that we spoke last time. And the interesting thing about Treasury Direction is that it actually trumps the guidance that James mentioned. It has more legal effect, and so we spent the whole afternoon sort of pouring through that, and as with the guidance, it didn't quite match the guidance in a number of respects. The one that really stuck out was it introduced a completely new concept. So it actually said that the employee must have agreed in writing that they will cease all work. Now, in the early days of furlough, quite a few people would have sent out letters which didn't actually deal with the specific fact that employees should not work whilst on furlough. That actually came a little bit later, about the second reiteration of the guidance. And so there was some concern at that point, well, crikey, this is a completely new obligation. If we don't actually have a separate confirmation in writing from the employee that they won't work, does that mean that we won't be able to claim the grant or actually have it taken back by the HMRC at some point in the future? So a lot of people did write to in those categories of situations if it wasn't in the furlough letter. By that stage, a lot of people, when they'd been sending out furlough letters, did actually have in the letter that whilst on furlough, you are not allowed to do any work. But we had this period of head scratching, a lot of toing and froing with the Treasury saying, look, this doesn't make sense and this is really important, so please could you give some clarity. So I'd say James and I are quite relaxed about that now, because we have had various letters and emails that we've seen from the Treasury. None of them are completely official, but our view is that as long as when you furlough somebody, they have consented to furlough, and you confirm that in writing, and it makes it very clear in the letter they cannot work whilst on furlough, and they have replied either by signing and returning a letter or electronically agreeing, then we are very comfortable with that. But it's another example, and there's no blame to be accredited here. This has been a really difficult period for everybody, but it's another example where a lot of the guidance has been ambiguous and has changed. And on the slide, the final point there, the guidance which came on 23rd of April, we think was supposed to try and clarify this issue, but it didn't mention the word work. It talked about furlough again, and then it actually put in some more unhelpful wording that an employer does not have to provide a written response, which actually isn't right, because of course the whole point is having an employee's consent. But so that was of some concern to quite a lot of people for a period of time, but we are now much more relaxed. James.
Okay, thank you for that, David. So let's talk about annual leave. For a long time, as we were going through the guidance and the various iterations of the guidance, we were suffering from a bit of angst, I must say. There was a lot of speculation. Can you have somebody on furlough and have somebody on holiday at the same time? So employment law doesn't like two separate states existing at the same time. So for example, we've seen for a long time with people who are off sick for long periods of time, so off sick for a whole year, so European law says, aha, they should still be entitled to their statutory holiday, and they can put their hand up metaphorically and say, although I'm long-term sick and I've run out of company sick pay and I've run out of SSP, actually I can say I'd like to take my holiday and then get 100% for that statutory holiday. Lots of people saying, furlough and holiday must be akin to sickness and holiday, therefore they are mutually exclusive states. I was never fully convinced by that, and I got to the stage of this doesn't work. This is a scheme to help employers. It's not a scheme to penalise employers where employees take holiday. Because if you run the argument to its logical conclusion, if the speculators were right that they are mutually exclusive states, you'd end up with a situation where an employee on furlough says, I'm going to take holiday. At that point, the poor cash-strapped employer has to then fund 100% of that holiday pay when it presumably doesn't have any income at that point and can't afford it. So reason one out, and this is where I and David and others had landed, which is that if an employee chooses to take holiday during furlough, then the furlough scheme picks up the 80% / £2,500, but the employer has to top up. So we had a couple of bank holidays, didn't we, over Easter, and we've got another one coming up on Friday. Employers need to top up to the normal pay for those. And if an employee says, I'd like to take a week's holiday, they take the week's holiday, they stay within the furlough scheme on the 3-week rotational basis, but the employer tops up. So far, so sensible, I would say. The bit that's unknown, as the slide suggests, is what if the employer wants the employee on furlough, to take holiday rather than the employee electing to do so. Government has had numerous opportunities to deal with this, has been put under quite a lot of pressure to deal with this, and has either chosen or omitted to do so. So we had from the government this extension of statutory holiday so that it can be taken up to 2 years, primarily aimed at key workers, but not exclusive to key workers. And that was the bit where you could say, well, look, actually, employees can defer their holiday, take it in an extended period of time. But a lot of employers will be thinking, actually, when we come out of this, I was on a webinar with a guy from the CBI who said, if and when we come out of this. I did say, if, really? Can we focus on the when, please? But when we come out of this, actually, I don't want employees on holiday. I want them ready and willing to undertake the work and actually use the furlough scheme to offset the cost of the holiday. So can you do it? My commercial view is, yes, you can. It's not set in stone that you can, but I would take the commercial pragmatic view that actually it's sensible. Certainly employees can elect to do so, and you should be able to do so. If it's statutory holiday, you of course have to give double the amount of notice. So if you want the employee to take a week's notice, you have to give 2 weeks leave. Okay, David.
I will just take a question that's come in, which is a good question actually, which we've dealt with quite a few times before. Can a company link compulsory redundancy alongside furlough? I won't comment on the specific situation. The broad answer is yes. Now, so if any companies going forward, and probably doing this at the moment as well, have been thinking, well, replace people on furlough, but we still need to make redundancies. You can do that. Okay, you can have a combination of the two. From a redundancy perspective, if somebody's thinking about being unhappy about being selected for redundancy, they've got 2 years employment, as you know, they could consider bringing a claim for unfair dismissal. What's important, there's obviously a very clear procedure you would follow, but before you get to that, in considering making redundant, it's always important to make sure that actually redundancy is essentially the last resort. So as part of that thinking, you would obviously have to consider the furlough scheme. But as long as you've considered the furlough scheme and you still, from a financial perspective, and having crunched the numbers, unfortunately take the decision that, well, you can put some people on furlough, but you're still not going to be viable as a business going forward, you can take the decision to go ahead with redundancy. You then do get some interesting questions about selection, but obviously, as with any redundancy situation, it's looking at the parts of the business which are going to be the most affected. So quite a lot of planning to get right before you do that, but in summary, you can do both.
Just on that, David, I also think that you will get some noise, because if the purpose of the scheme is not just to avoid redundancies, but to support businesses which may have been affected by the virus, what you will get from some employees if you try to make them redundant during a period of furlough, of course, is, well, hang on a minute, why should I be made redundant now? Why can't you just keep me on furlough for now? Then you've got to weigh up that moral pressure that you might get from the employee versus if you go through the redundancy process, actually, as we'll come on to look later, you might be able to offset some costs using the furlough scheme and notice. But
yeah,
we'll come to that later.
You'd hopefully made that decision that you've got to go ahead and you've crunched the numbers, but absolutely as part of the consultation, when people put that forward as a proposal, obviously you would look at it again with them. So as you will remember, originally where people were new to a company employed after the 28th of February, they could not benefit from being placed on furlough. There was a lot of press about that. There's whole groups of people who had just left a job and started a new one and couldn't be placed on furlough. So the government decided that it was actually only fair to then extend that to the 19th of March, which was when essentially the furlough scheme was initially announced. And that looked great on the face of it, and people were very happy. But the devil in the detail with all these things, the small writing was very important, because it also said, but the employee had to be on the payroll system on or before the 19th. And the reality, I suspect a lot of you say, is when you run your payroll at the end of the month, the reality is that your people will not be on your RTI submission form until after the 19th. So actually, in reality, it didn't capture as many people as originally it had been hoped. James.
Yeah, just on that, the same guy from the CBI said the government thought it would capture 300,000 people, actually might capture less than 50. It was just, you query why they put the 19th of March in, but maybe it was just the government being clever and cleverer than me, because I don't quite understand that. Okay, RTI, real-time information. So it's the upload to the HMRC database, which payroll does to put everyone's details in, and then they get paid. That's what RTI stands for. That was live chat, that was, David. Hey, hey.
I like that. I like that. Thank you, Julia.
So, all right, please, everyone stay awake, but I'm going to talk about pensions for a couple of minutes. Very disrespectful to my pensions colleagues, but they'll understand. When we started off on this furlough journey, we had a lot of concern expressed about, oh, hang on a minute, are we going to be into collective consultation if we are proposing to dismiss lots of employees? What are we going to do about pensions? Should we be undertaking 60 days pension consultation here with the workforce if we're going to be making those changes? And that was a risk that we advised some clients about and said, well, it seems nuts. If we need to make changes, we need to make changes now, not waiting for 2 months before we can make the change. So that pretty much went away. But now we're into a scheme, a situation where we know the grant says we'll pay 80% of someone's normal pay, capped at 2.5 grand. The government will then give you the employer's NIC on top and the minimum auto-enrollment contribution under pension, the employer contribution. So there's been a lot of thought about actually, if somebody in particular is in salary sacrifice, how does that work out? How does that shake through? And I'm not going to do some maths with you, so you just need to, I'll keep it at a high level and we'll hopefully stay at a high level. But if you're in a salary sacrifice situation, the way that the grant works is that if your reference salary is, say, £30,000, but you've sacrificed some salary to get a higher, typically, pension contribution, so the employer is saving the national insurance because you're going to a reduced salary, but you're gaining because you're getting a higher pension contribution. Let's say reference salary is £30,000, adjusted salary is, say, £28,000. The grant under the furlough scheme takes the adjusted sum, the lower sum. So the effect of that is you are penalising the employee in a way because they're only going to get 80% of the adjusted sum. The employer is going to have to pay out still all of that higher pension contribution. So with that didn't really quite work. So what we came up with is, and the government finally confirmed, was if you needed to come out of the salary sacrifice scheme, that's called a life event, and that is permitted. So actually, if you do the maths, there are 3 scenarios. The first is that first one, employees on the adjusted salary, employers paying the higher employer contribution. If you come out of salary sacrifice, great, but you're still in auto-enrollment contributions. So you go back up to the reference salary, in my example, £30,000, but you're still, the employee is then paying probably 5% employee contribution, and the employer is then getting reimbursed for the minimum 3%. Actually, if cash is key to the employee at that point and they want to maximize it, they might want to come out of auto-enrollment as well. You cannot be inducing that or encouraging somebody, but you can give them the facts, just the facts, and they can make that decision for themselves. If they do that, they come out of salary sacrifice, they opt out of auto-enrollment for a period of time whilst they're on furlough, and then they will get more cash and the employer is better off as well. So you really need to work through that. Quite complicated. We can pick up later if needs be, but basically that works. You need to do the maths to see if it benefits you and your employees in that situation. As the slide says, can't go below the statutory minimum if you stay within auto-enrollment. What the regulator said on the 9th of April was, this is fine, we're not going to penalise somebody for not undertaking 60 days consultation about changes to pension. Good news, but this only relates to furloughed employees. So many of our clients have been not just been looking at furlough, but are looking at workers who are still in the business, still busy, and therefore, what do we do with them? Do we cut pay for them? Do we seek consent for that? And we'll come onto that in a bit. But actually, do we try and make some pension changes as well? What we're having here is, actually, do we need to think about undertaking 60 days pension consultation there if we're changing things for non-furloughed employees? Again, we're back to, hello, let's have a reality test here. We haven't got time to do 60 days consultation. If you seek consent and you get consent, maybe you push it through. If you're doing things by imposition, i.e. unilateral variation, you might later catch a cold where somebody says that should have required 60 days consultation, which would be a harsh penalty in these straitened times, I have to say. David.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because I think it's £50,000 fine, but
yeah,
actually in the history of the regulator, only 2 fines have ever been levied. So my personal view, as James said, is really harsh. So I just don't think that they will be looking in any detail. It's only if employers were to abuse the system at some point, or didn't put people back onto normal pension contributions at a later stage. Okay, next slide, James. So on the 15th of April, we talked quite a bit about the fact that when somebody is on furlough, they cannot work. And you'll remember that there are some exceptions to that. So if people are doing voluntary work, or if people are doing training, as long it is not providing services to or generating revenue for your organisation or a linked organisation. Okay. We also flagged back in the last seminar that we also thought that there would be an exception for people that are doing consultation, and the 7th version of the guidance proved us right. We're pleased to report. So give some examples there. So where you have somebody on furlough who's asked to be a companion for another employee in a disciplinary or grievance scenario, then that's not work. So that's fine, that can happen. And indeed, if you are starting, for example, collective consultation at some point, even with people on furlough, then the employee reps are able to carry out their normal employee rep role, and that will not constitute work. James.
Sorry, I need to come off mute, schoolboy error. So this is just the headlines of what we're going to come on to next. So we've spent the first half an hour or so just looking at where we've got to. Let's now channel our inner mystic Megs. Remember her? I'm sure you do. For those who don't, Google it. Is what is going to happen in the future. Julia, you're on it. Thank you very much. So how quickly is everything going to return to normal? As David says, hopefully we will get some guidance from Boris on Sunday. Actually, as the question is, do we need to reshape the business in the meantime? Will work have gone off? Do we need to make some redundancies? Do we need to cut some costs anyway? Do you have the right people in place to be able to meet future demand? Is the future demand going to have changed from what it was in the past? And what steps do we need to take to return? So we've worked out that there are 3 potential buckets, I'll call them, to look at. So BAU, business as usual. In an ideal world, everything just gets switched back on. We all go back to work. Everything is wonderful. Isn't that? But, well, given the, I don't know how many of you have seen this, so that the government has put out 7 draft papers on how it's going to look when we go back to work. So one of the feeds, BuzzFeed, has got hold of 7 of these. BBC's only got hold of 1 of them, and they talk about a number of different ways that we could go back to work. And I'll just pick up some of those. Or David, do you want to pick up some of those?
Yeah, I'll pick those up.
Okay, fine. They are, I would reiterate, I would stress they are in draft at the moment, and they may change. So that's the first one. Second one, reduce staff costs. How are we going to do that? And then redundancies, and I will pick up that. It's going to be interesting, actually, how we shape our businesses for the future, because I don't think business as usual is going to be realistic, certainly in the short term. Okay, David.
Yeah, I mean, so we've had quite a lot of questions already about how do you end furlough. I mean, there's no prescribed way of doing it. Obviously, anything that you've put in the furlough letter, you follow that. But essentially, it's notifying somebody that furlough is coming to an end. Remember to claim. You've got a minimum 3-week period. So, but post that, you just confirm in writing what's a reasonable notice. There's no guidance on this. Obviously, as much notice as you can probably give, but it could be quite short in certain circumstances. Yeah, as James said, I mean, so from an employment law perspective, all sorts of things come into play. Obviously, we have a duty of care towards employees. There are various polls and stats going around at the moment, but high percentages in the 40% of people that reply to the various polls say that they are nervous about going back to work, and all sorts of potential. So, for example, if people are happy, we could be seeing, an increase in grievances. If people raise issues around health and safety, and we say, no, you've still got to come back to work, are we going to start to see some whistleblowing claims at some point going forward? If people become ill, it's a difficult claim, but are we going to start to see some personal injury claims and saying, well, I was absolutely fine, but as soon as I came back to work, I felt ill and it had some serious consequences. So all sorts of issues for us to think about. We should hopefully get proper copies of the 7 guidance notes that James just mentioned that the government have been working on, and I've just put on the slide, the types of issues that we need to think about. But it's everything, isn't it, from people being able to get to work, public transport. You would have seen the various stats from London Underground. They think that the maximum capacity that they can run is 15%. How's that going to work in practice? Think about queues of people trying to actually get down into the underground. But it's going to be the same here locally as well, with people that use public transport to get to work. Then at work itself, social distancing within work. So it's going to mean in offices, it's going to mean that certain desks aren't going to be used. We're going to be getting rid of hot desking. So people are just going to have a prescribed desk, so they're not moving around different workstations. The use of screens. What about PPE? So are we going to require people to wear masks? Are we going to undertake testing in the workplace? There's some general guidance in these drafts for all workplaces, and obviously it talks about things which you would have already been thinking about: staggering arrival departure times. You could have people working in your organisation one week and then at home for the next week, for example. Reducing congestion, having more entry points to the workplace, have a different entry to an exit. It's about actually having doors permanently open, hand washing, hand sanitizing, which we were probably doing quite a lot before we locked down in any event. But thinking about printers, should everybody be using printers? Because there's a lot of people touching them. So there's a whole go onto BuzzFeed and have a look at that. But I know a lot of you doing a lot of work on this already. But there's a big issue, I think, also about reassuring staff. And if you just flick over, James. As has been crucial throughout this entire period, employee well-being. People on furlough, keeping in contact with them, people having financial and other difficulties, mental health obviously has been affected for most people to some degree. People working from home have had ups and downs and found that actually very difficult as well. It's going to be exactly the same when we return to work. And as I say, the stats show that people are going to be nervous about returning to work. Obviously, people who are vulnerable won't be able to return to work, but I think we're going to have to continue doing a lot of work around that. The other thing I think is quite interesting is also the shape of our organisations going forward. Back in the last recession in 2008, when we started coming out of the recession, we did a lot of work, and a lot of businesses did, on actually having then reviewed things. Have we got the right, not just the right numbers of people, but have we got the right people within our organisation? And actually, is this an opportunity to shake it up to some degree? Do actually we need different people to take us in a different direction going forward? And then from just a practical perspective, as we did in the last recession, where a lot of people actually decided to drop down to part-time or work in a different way, they then, post the recession, wanted to continue working in a similar manner. So, and I suspect we're going to see that again to some degree, and James is right, people working from home at the moment, I suspect, will be requested, the emphasis will be to continue working from home for a long period of time. Some people will get to a point where they do want to do a day-to-day, even if it's perhaps once a week, and get into the office and get back to that kind of environment. But I suspect going forward there will be more people looking at home working in other flexible ways. So plenty to think about. I don't know if you've got anything else you want to add, James. There's quite a few chats coming through.
Yeah, I was going to let you look at those while I do the next bit. I know there's one on pensions, which we might pick up at the end.
Okay, that's all I'm going to say then.
Sorry, what was that, David?
That's all I was going to say then. So
okay, yeah, I think the likes of David and I, who are sitting working at home and are able to work at home, are going to be one of the last to go back to work. I have to say, I'm missing going back to work. I really miss my sit-stand desk, I have to say. It's not the same at home. Okay, so reducing staff costs. So as David has talked about, some of you, if you went through furlough, and a lot of our clients would have said, please consent Fred and Ginger to being put on furlough. Some of our clients have just said, Fred and Ginger, you are now on furlough. And certainly where the numbers were sufficiently large, we're talking thousands, it just happened. Other ones where the culture was strong enough, consent was sought and gained. So we're then thinking about, okay, if we come back and we are post whatever the furlough scheme is, so that may be 1st of July, or it might be whenever an extension of that from 30th of June expires, in whatever form it is, we're going to get our workforce back. Do we want to go to our workforce and say, actually, we need everybody, but we only need some of you for a period of time, or we can need everybody, but we can't afford you all at 100%, and therefore do we want to have a reduction in pay, but you're working 100% of the hours, or a reduction in pay and a reduction in hours? So quite a lot of people are thinking about going to a 20% reduction, so 4/5. So that seems to be quite common. If you go to your employee and say, will you consent to that? And they say yes, you go, great, move on, tick the box, document it, move on, and they will only therefore work 4/5. If they say no, what are you going to do then? Well, life gets quite interesting in legal terms at that point, and the lawyers, like when you take your car in for a service and the mechanic goes, your big end's gone, or whatever it is when they look under the bonnet. If you start imposing unlawful deduction from wages, i.e. pay cuts, to employees, stuff happens. So one is an unlawful deduction from wages. The employee can bring that claim and they will win because you have imposed a pay cut. The reality is that claim will not be heard for many, many months to come. The tribunal system is overloaded and relatively broken. Hearings, substantive hearings, are not going to be heard for probably 18 months to 2 years. So from a justice perspective, that isn't good. If the employee chooses to take that reduction in pay as an opportunity to resign and claim constructive dismissal, again, they're likely to win. But again, they are under duty to mitigate their loss. They should be able to go out and find another job. That might be hard, even though we're coming out of this. But again, they're not going to be heard in terms of having a hearing for a very long period of time. So query whether anyone will do that. So it might be that you just go, James, oh, that's all very interesting. Those are legal risks. Practically, I can't, to repeat the word practically, go out to X hundred staff and say, will you please consent? I just don't have time to do that. And what I don't want to do is seek consent, not get it, and then impose the change anyway. I just want to impose the change. And we've got a client that's doing that right now because they are up against it. So the question is, do you do it on the basis that you say to the employees, look, we're doing this to safeguard your jobs. We know that it's unpalatable. We know it's tough. As long as management are perhaps sharing the pain as well, maybe you appeal to hearts and minds, you get your communication right, and therefore you try and force it through with a bit of goodwill. If you force it through and have no goodwill in it and haven't communicated it properly, I think you'll have a lot of disgruntled employees. So there are some real issues about imposing a staff cost. Consequently, or conversely, perhaps, if you seek consent and it's not forthcoming, if you don't like the idea of imposing the pay cut, what do you do then? Do you go through a dismissal and re-engagement process? So you say to everybody, can't afford you on 100% post the end of the furlough scheme, but we might be able to afford you on 80% of your pay and your hours. So if you don't agree, I'm going to go through a dismissal and re-engagement process. Okay, that might work, but that's going to take a long time. And that is probably going to amount to collective consultation, which I'll come on to in a minute. So you've got to think about when, and timing is key here. So I will look at that in the context of a headcount reduction. So enabling slides, we need to look at various things. How many redundancies, minimum periods, timing. Timing is crucial here. Practicalities, costs, and risks if you get it wrong. So let's look at how many redundancies we would be making. So if we are in the usual collective consultation process, 20 or more at one establishment within a period of 90 days, we are into collective consultation. Therefore, that would be a 30-day minimum collective consultation period. If it's 100 or more at one establishment within a period of 90 days, you're looking at 45 days. Conversely, less than 20, only individual. You're not in collective. Hurrah. Now, just to pause on that point, this is under the wider definition of redundancy. So redundancy is your headcount reduction, but it's also where you're proposing to dismiss. So in my example of trying to push through dismissal and re-engagement, that would also trigger collective consultation. Remember that for timing. Some of you might remember Woolworths. David, I'm sure you were one of those children who never stole any sweets from the pick and mix. Is that right?
Terrible, terrible thing to say, James.
I said you weren't one of those people. Oh, so it's terrible that you
just to even insinuate that they ever stooped so low. I used to go to Woolworths every Saturday.
Very good, and never stole anything from the pick and mix. Excellent. So, for those of you who are old enough to remember Woolworths, there was a case recently when Woolworths went pop, all about what is an establishment. And I won't bore you with the long litigation, but it came down to this. An establishment is basically a store, an autonomous store, and each Woolworths store was held to be an establishment. That was important because if in your organizations you have different sites, you're looking at the collective consultation test of 20 or more at one establishment in the period of 90 days. So you, rather than looking at holistically across your group or across your site, you can go per site. It's a bit more than that, but that's the headlines. So Woolworths is very helpful in trying to perhaps reduce the risk of collective consultation applying. I'll talk through the first of those bullet points. Now, timing. So if we are going to have no extension of the furlough scheme beyond the end of June, are we not looking at getting our ducks in a row PDQ? So if it's 45 days, because we're looking at 100 or more employees, then middle of May is our 45-day point before the 30th of June. So in a way, it's now, what, 6th of May? We really haven't got long if we are anticipating that there will be a cliff edge. Now, I shared on LinkedIn this morning an article from The Guardian following an interview with the Chancellor who's saying there shouldn't be a cliff edge. Hurrah. So we shouldn't be facing a situation that come close of play on the 30th of June, we will be having a situation where the furlough scheme ends, and therefore you need to have worked backwards from that to have undertaken both your collective consultation and then your individual consultation, which follows collective consultation, to have got your ducks in a row. Because if you, frankly, you can't afford to keep your employees at full pay after the government grant has disappeared, you need to have been making preparations to work out what you're going to do. That might be the pay cap that I was talking about. It might be headcount reductions. There's all sorts of things here about strategy and whether you're going to seek consent and hope you're going to get enough people that will consent, which might avoid collective consultation, or you're just going to go, oh, that takes time in itself, and that might make me closer to the end of the furlough period, whether that's 30th of June or extended. So actually, I'm just going to go nuclear, and I'm going to file what's called my HR1, which is the formal notification to the government that you are in collective consultation. And therefore, it is key to think about what you want to do, how you're going to do it, and be prepared. Because the key advantage here, and we touched on this earlier, is the notice period and the furlough scheme. So our view is, if ultimately you get to a point where you are giving notice to somebody, so whether that's an individual redundancy situation, as David was answering a question on the chat about earlier, or it's wider than that and we're giving notice to lots of people, that notice period can't expire until the end of the collective consultation period. But if we're giving notice period, if you're still within the furlough scheme, you can be offsetting the cost of notice using the furlough scheme. Not 100%, but our view is that that works, but you've got to top it up. I think it's probably there. I'd go stronger than that and say you will need to top up to their normal pay. But there's a huge advantage there of part of people's notice periods being paid for through the furlough scheme. I've taken that at a bit of a pace, but hopefully that makes some sense. Some risks, the usual risks, you cock it up, you're going to be faced with unfair dismissal. If you mess up and don't comply with the collective consultation obligations, that's called a protective pay award. That is a punitive award, and that is 13 weeks uncapped pay per employee. So if you take your payroll and divide it by 4 for your affected employees, that is the protective pay award. It is horrible, and it is not subject to mitigation for loss. It is merely a, have you done enough? If you haven't done enough, you potentially are facing a protective pay award. Can be quite rare. Certainly unions are more aware of it than individual employees, but Google is their friend. And obviously, if you get your process wrong and are discriminatory in that, you may be faced with some discrimination claims as well. Okay, I will just put it on our hub, which is...
Yeah, just sorry, James, we've got over time, just sort of, there's some stuff on chat.
Yeah, sure.
I was just going to add, I mean, the timing thing for me, if you just pop back to the previous slide, I think the timing thing for me is really important, because in the normal event, if you're changing terms and conditions, you're proposing to change terms and conditions, normally you wouldn't want to get into that collective route earlier rather than later. You might, because actually you don't want to dismiss and engage. So actually you start your consultation on, say, dropping down to 80% of pay post furlough, okay, because you still can't afford it. And what you're hoping is most people are going to agree to that. So, that might be a week or a couple of weeks, and you discover after that consultation that 20 or more people aren't going to agree. So as James says, then what's the safe legal way to proceed? You then, if you can't get their agreement, and you would hope that people would change their mind, if they don't, you then dismiss on notice and offer re-engagement on the same terms. And people have quite long periods of notice. So, that could be another 3 months on top of the 2 or 3 weeks consultation already. But then you've also got to factor in the collective redundancy consultation. So, which is the 30 days and the 45 days. Suddenly, it gets very elongated, doesn't it, James? So if you're going to do, so that's the really big point. If you're thinking about what life is going to look after, like after furlough, and you pretty much know, having crunched the numbers, that you're going to have to make more changes and possibly some redundancies, must be looking at that now, because that timetable really can potentially stretch quite a long period of time. So
I agree with that. Consent is your friend, absolutely. If you can get consent and avoid a collective consultation, boy, that's a lot easier. And
it's interesting, James and I had this debate that, and I think we mentioned this on the last webinar, getting people's consent at the beginning to this was relatively easy, that people understand the difficult period we're going through. The longer this goes on, and the more effect on individuals not being able to afford mortgages, etc., the less likely they're going to consent. And so the way that you explain this to people, again, is paramount, isn't it, James? In that you've got to be explaining, it's hearts and minds, you've got to be explaining to people how bad your financial position is, so they are much more likely to agree to the change. Because if they don't, then we get into some quite lengthy potential consultation.
Great. Right. Should we just pick up some questions? So Hannah, I won't come and ask you to say this out loud, but we may make more than 20 redundant, don't have employee reps. Could the collective consultation be a week, then individual consultation? The answer is, if you're making more than 20, you will need to put reps in place, and you'll need to go through an appointment or election process. Very difficult with people on furlough, but not impossible. I wouldn't worry about ICE. And then you'll have to do collective consultation. My view on that is the whole 45 day process, most reps will get while we're doing this, and you won't need the whole of those 30 or 45 days, and you can get them to sign off on the big picture and then move on to individual consultation. So 30 or 45 days is your maximum periods. Hopefully you should get less than that.
The counter, the interesting thing that, the counter, I don't disagree, but the counter to that is, if people realise that there are going to be redundancies, then how do they maximise the payments to them? And that is to make sure, as a rep, you just keep consulting for the full 30 or 45 days. Completely agree.
It's turkeys voting for Christmas if they go and sign off earlier. Most of them are professional, in my view, and don't take silly views. From Sabir, what's the legal position? There was a consultation on pay cuts, but hierarchy have stated their position and will not consider any responses. Well, that's not meaningful consultation. If it is just a stated, we won't care what you say, I don't agree that that's consultation.
The government guidance states that if we can work from home, we should do. Remember, it's in draft at the moment, so it hasn't been published. But if the emphasis is on people working from home, and the employer entitled to ask us to go into premises? Possibly. I suspect what the guidance will say is, if you can work from home, as the case at the moment. But if then an employer has a very good requirement why it needs somebody in the office, as it could do now, then that would be legitimate. But again, it's about being also sensitive to the employee, and to some degree, are they? Yes, just giving them some reassurance that the steps that you've put in place have enabled a safe workplace in as far as possible.
Agreed. And yes, thank you for getting my references. Julia, what would be the implication of consent return to work?
It's a similar point, and Julia goes on to say about employee responsibility, which I would agree with, because absolutely we as employers have got to put very good processes, equipment, etc. in place, but we obviously need to be reminding employees that they've also got to comply. Lots of reports about potentially in construction industry, employees not social distancing, etc. So absolutely, that has to be an onus on employees taking responsibility as well.
We do with the pensions point from Sabir. Yes, if they opt out of auto enrolment, that means no employee or employer pension contributions, but you'd only do that on a temporary basis. I think that was it. There is
so
one question. Hang on.
Yeah, I think you could probably leave that one actually.
Oh, okay.
Quite detailed.
Sorry, Steph.
So just to sum up, obviously lots happened since we last spoke. We probably anticipate less happening in terms of all. We've had a couple of minor changes to the guidance over the last few weeks, so we're not expecting anything major to change. So I think the key really is now forward looking, how long furlough is going to continue, and then steps that you need to take as a business around that. And I know a lot of you are already working on, and once we get these guidance out, actually really planning quite hard for a potential gradual return to work and what that's going to look like. So if you just go to the next slide, James. As we pointed out last time, we have plenty of information on our coronavirus hub on the Mills Reeve website, not just from an employment perspective, but for all different manner of parts of your business. Please do look at that. Thank you for participation. We'll hand you back to Mark.
Great, and lovely. Thanks very much, David and James. Yeah, really good to get a bit more of a sort of live snapshot as to where we are now. I'm sure when we finish this in 10 minutes time, some of it will have changed as it did do last time round, but we will keep up to date. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us this morning as well. And again, it's really good content. It's really good for us to keep up to date and understanding what these changes look like. And there will be further changes. And you know, this cliff edge moment is really, really important. The article that James shared, if people haven't read it, it's certainly worth having a look at. We can perhaps put it on the follow-up email as well. Reference here around BuzzFeed, we can probably put that. I had a little look while the content was going. We can probably share these links as well, because I think some stuff there gives a lot of people food for thought. When we follow up, we will have the slides. We will do so with a recording as well, so people can have a sort of catch up of some of the content. And yeah, we'll also be asking people for their feedback. So on the feedback, there'll be an opportunity for you to comment and see what else you want to be able to hear about. Now, I do appreciate come the end of this week, sort of coming into the weekend and Sundays, when the new government legislative updates are going to be and how we're going to phase this back in for us working and what this means to businesses. So we're having a bit of a rest from our webinar series for now. So this is the sixth, I think, we've had in the series, which has been great. All videos are now available to look at, and we'll be reviewing what this looks like for probably the coming sort of couple of months. So please comment, let us know what it is you want to hear about, because we'll be able to shape the contents around your comments. So that's everything from me. If people do want to ask any sort of recruitment related market insight stuff, then please feel free to. The market has changed so drastically. We've noticed a significant shift in our temporary and our contract supply forces is probably what is actually out there in the marketplace and is continuing to supply. And obviously different divisions have been more effective at the moment. So IT and our technical, FMCG and manufacturing have been quite strong, whereas the others have a significant decline. So any questions you want to find out, this isn't necessarily you giving us jobs or anything to recruit, we're happy to help and happy to consult with you, so please do. We'll share all the information and we'll get that email over to you all very soon. So I just wish you all a very fond farewell. Yeah, stay safe and look after yourselves, and we'll catch up with you all soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, James. David.